Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Eva Dace and I'm a member of the marketing department here at Vitech Corporation. I'll be your host during today's webinar as Zane Scott and Jim Obermayer present How to Supercharge Your Projects with Core 9. Our program today is sponsored by Vitech Corporation, a 21-year-old company that offers model-based software and services. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few technical details. First, questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the question and chat functions in the GoToWebinar window. We'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation and we'll address them at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned. Second, I'd like to answer our most asked question. The webinar is being recorded today. You can find the recording in the webinar archive in the resources section of our website within 24 hours of the live presentation. Now let me introduce our presenters. Zane Scott is the Vice President of Professional Services here at Vitech, where he is the head of consulting services. For more than 6 years before joining Vitech, he worked on DoD contracts, analyzing and improving processes, and applying best practice models using MBSE and Core to provide the modeling support. He has taught in a variety of disciplines in college and professional classes. He's a trained hostage negotiator and interventional mediator and speaks often on communication and conflict management. Jim Obermayer is Vitech's VP of Business Development. Prior to joining Vitech, Jim was a principal of Sales Leakage Consulting. He has been a VP of Sales and Marketing at several software companies. He's an author and co-author of 4 books on sales and marketing and is a frequent speaker at industry events. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Jim and Zane. Welcome, and thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva, and good day to everyone wherever in the world you reside, because many of the people that attend this program are all over the world. I am Jim Obermayer, your host, and we will be joined in a few minutes by Zane Scott, our presenter. Our program today, the program title really is, as you can see, Core 9 in Systems Engineering the Business Case. Today you'll learn how using Vitech's Core 9 software will bring value, clarity, completeness, and precision to avoid unnecessary rework and cost escalation. Zane Scott, our presenter, a few weeks ago we were talking about this program, and I wrote down some of the things Zane was talking about, because everybody what's the basis behind this webinar? What are we trying to communicate? And Zane really said, during these days of cost containment, the business case for model-based systems engineering tools is very important. As engineers seek ways to reduce risk and program delays, it's time for MBSE to be recognized for the leading framework it is in helping to deliver value to the customer as forecasted. This really sets the stage for our program today. We are not going to go over all the features and benefits of Core 9 or how the tool works. This is not a buttonology class. It's a look at some of the business-based benefits of using Core 9. Now, a little bit about Core, just one sentence for those of you that are new to this. Core 9 is Vitech's flagship product, and it provides a comprehensive systems engineering and project management tool set designed from the inside out for the efficient management of complex systems engineering problems. Zane, let's get started. Are you there?
I am indeed, Jim.
Now, go ahead.
You know, the traditional trade-off when we talk about tools is a trade-off between tools that are easy and tools that are powerful. Very often, in order to get the power, the tool got more complex. And it really was like the difference between riding a basic bicycle and riding a motorcycle. When I see this illustration, I think about my youngest brother. When I was in college and he was in high school, I brought a girl home with me for one of our breaks, and he immediately wanted to take her out and show her his mini bike. So he got her on the mini bike, and she was an adventurous sort, so he basically showed her around the controls and then turned her loose. And as I looked out the window, I saw her go down the driveway, over the bank, and into the woods, because as she accelerated, the more excited she got, the harder she twisted the accelerator, and she hadn't mastered the controls on how to slow down and stop. And so he was running after her into the woods to find where she crashed.
Did you marry her, or did she skip?
No,
did she
no,
pass
no,
on that?
no.
No.
That relationship didn't happen, but I've always thought of that in terms of how complex the tool is, and in relationship to how quickly you can just jump on it and see results.
Well, shouldn't a systems engineering tool be easy to use? I mean,
yeah, it sure should, and you ought not to have to make a dramatic trade-off here. So we ought to be able to wed the concept of a tool that's relatively easy to use, and of course you're not going to achieve ultimate simplicity and ultimate power in the same tool, but you ought to have a reasonable combination of those two there. So certainly the answer to the question is yes. Let's look at some of the things that make an easy to use tool easy to use.
okay.
The traditional type drawing tool, and I made this one up because I'm not here to criticize particular tools or approaches. So this is an imaginary drawing tool, but it's fairly representative of what we would want in an easy to use tool, and that is we want to be able to drag and drop. So when we design, when we begin to do diagrams, we want to be able to go over here on the right side and grab an entity or grab a control construct, grab an input, grab an output, and drag it out onto the canvas there in the middle and put those things together and construct a diagram that perhaps traces the behavior and tells us how that flows through our system, or a diagram that shows our components. So that's the ease of use component, and we like to have the visual interface. You know, it's very difficult to visualize something if you're being forced to work through a textual interface and you're describing things textually. It's much easier if you can begin by visualizing it, by having a picture in your head and a picture on your paper. So these tools have evolved, the easy-to-use drawing type tools have evolved to do just that. You can drag and drop, you can pull elements over, you can construct them together, and pretty rapidly people realize that you're not going to do just one drawing and forget it, but you're going to want to do multiple drawings, and in the multiple drawings you're going to want to use the same kinds of, in this case in a behavior diagram, the same functions that step through. So fairly quickly the drawing tools evolved to have the capability that we see represented over on the left side, and that is, as you create an entity, for instance in your diagram, it saves it, and it saves the name and the number and the information that you can put in about that entity, so that when you make different drawings and different views about that system, you're able to reuse those elements and reuse the name, and you're not forced to start over again completely from scratch, but you now have drag and drop capability on the elements you created as well as the basic constructs.
So in this case you're starting to create the model from the diagram, correct?
Yeah, you're making
rather than text,
a view of the model, and
right.
You're not forced to just work through a textual window. You're going to have to work, in this case, you're going to have to work in some tool that allows you to save text, because you've got lots of information that you can't attach to these little boxes.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're trying to do is you're trying to draw diagrams in a visual and intuitive way. Now, the ability to reuse these elements gives you the ability to construct a new diagram, and you are saved some of your effort by the fact that you can reuse those elements that you created when you drew the first diagram. So you've got them over there on the left side, and you can drag and drop them out along with the particular controls to configure your drawing the way you want to do it for the second diagram. Where it gets dicey is when you get to a diagram that you now have to use visual elements that look different. They express the same kind of information, but all of a sudden they look different. So now you have to redraw the elements. Excuse me, you have to use standard elements and reapply the information, and you're in a much more working from scratch kind of a situation. So if you notice there, we went from a functional flow block diagram to an activity diagram, and now from an activity diagram into a sequence diagram, all of the same functional flow that we had in the very first diagram. But each diagram has to be produced, and you've got an engineer or a set of engineers who are working on producing that. And so they have to be consistent, they have to work, there's some effort involved in getting those diagrams produced. So that's kind of the easy to use interface, which traditionally has been a trade-off against a more powerful tool like Core.
So those traditional diagramming products that are out there, you create one diagram and then you try to reuse things, and then you go to the next diagram and you have to rebuild it over again and you reuse what you can, and then you go to the next diagram and so on and so on.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what you would want to do is you really would want to get into a situation where you would have more power in terms of what's being saved in your work and how consistent you can be, and at the same time have ease of use.
Well, is Core easy to use? Is that what we're really looking at here? I mean, that's the bottom line. Why is Core easier to use in the diagramming than these other discrete tools?
Well, because we've worked pretty hard to wed that ease of use to the power of the Core tool. And this is a portion of the visual interface with Core. And you see that you have the drag and drop interface. And we do have the drag and drop capability now. So the power of the database, and we'll talk about exactly how this helps you and how it's true, but that's now wedded with this ease of use that comes to us through the visual interface in Core. So you see it's an interface that looks and works pretty much the same way as the interface that we were looking at with the drawing tool. So when we look at Core now, we can go over here on the right side and we can drag out the elements that go into the diagram, and drag out the control constructs, drag out inputs and triggers and outputs, and we can build that diagram. And this is actually a version of the same diagram that we were looking at a minute ago in the easy to use tool. And so we build it in the same way that we would in a drawing tool with the drag and drop capability. The trick is there's no need to really save the individual elements per se and put them into a menu on the left-hand side. And the reason for that is that the repository in Core, the engine, the back end that stands behind all this, is taking in the information that we're feeding it through the visual interface. So not only are these elements stored in that back end, but they're held in relationship back there. So it always knows that, as we see here in the middle of this diagram, that the formatted request is an output of accept and format request and an input to get the product from inventory. So no matter what we do with the rest of the database, no matter what information we want to get out of it, Core knows that that's the relationship. That's preserved in the database itself. We don't have to draw that back in. We don't have to draw that sequence back in every time. So there's no need to resave that element with that number and that name into a place where we can, a menu where we could drag it back out onto into the visual interface because it's there in the database.
So we've created this one diagram, but how does that compare to the other tools? You can create a diagram in other tools like this, and I realize you said that this gets saved to the repository, the database, but what good is that?
Well, let's compare directly. Let's mock up something here, and I think I can show you pretty powerfully exactly how it does compare. Let's compare the easy and powerful core interface with the easy interface of a drawing tool. So let's say that we've both drawn an EFFBD. We've drawn one in the drawing tool and we've drawn one in core. And we have essentially, you can see that's essentially the same diagram there. So now what we're going to do is, now that somebody comes in and says, hey, I have to have an activity diagram for this, that's fine. Your EFFBD is okay, but you know, that's fine for people who like that, but I need an activity diagram. I want a systematic diagram here. So we're going to begin. You know, we'll start the clock ticking and we'll begin. I'm done. And the reason I'm done is that all I have to do is go down there where the red arrow is, and instead of selecting the EFFBD tab, I now select the activity tab. So what core does is it takes my request for an activity diagram populated with that information and returns it to me immediately. Now, what's going on with the folks who have the easy tool, the drawing tool? Well, like the guy up in the right upper corner, they're working. Why? Because they're redrawing that diagram as an activity diagram with the activity diagram notation with it. And they're having to drag out the control constructs and drag out the elements that they have from both sides. They're working. Their work is eased some by the power of their tool, but it's nowhere near fast as a one-click diagram.
Because the database they're working off is really in their head, isn't it?
Yeah, they're drawing.
It's not saved in the tool anyplace.
Exactly. They're drawn from their head, or they're drawing from sketches done by somebody else, or they're drawing from a description. But the point is they're drawing. They're working. Whereas in our case, the tool is working. Now, if somebody comes in and says, hey, I'd like a sequence diagram for that functional flow. Well, again, we're one click away. They're probably still trying to draw the activity diagram at this point. Whereas core is simply reporting our information that's been saved in the database back to us. So if to come up with a sequence diagram is going to represent even more work on the part of the drawing tool. Now, if somebody comes and says, hey, my guys need an n-squared diagram of this, again, we're one click away. And whatever amount of work needs to be invested in reproducing that diagram. So yeah, it's relatively easy, you know, as compared, my dad was an industrial arts teacher, and we had a drafting table in our basement, and I can remember the day he brought home a drafting machine and freed us from the T-square attached to the edge of the drawing board. I thought I was cheating when I got that drafting machine with its arm that we could use to maneuver it around and set the angles exactly with the dial. Thought that was cheating. This drawing tool, of course, is way easier than producing drawings that way, for those of us who are old enough to remember that. But it's way harder. Core is another leap forward from that, because drawings are being produced by sending a query to the database and getting back an answer structured as the drawing. So if somebody were to come along here and say, I'd like to see an IDEF 0, well, again, one click. So with a succession of clicks, we've gone from an EFFBD to an activity diagram to a sequence diagram to an n-squared diagram to an IDEF 0 diagram. We have all of those. You can save them, you can print them out, you can put them into the report, you know, whatever you want to do with it. but we've produced all of that in less time than it's taken me to talk about.
And you did it because you created one diagram, but then you created all the subsequent diagrams because they're all the information resides in the repository. And now I'm going to ask the question that I think you're going to cover later on, but I can't help but ask it now, is if you make one change in one of the diagrams, does everything, the old way of doing things on these other drawing tools is you got to flop through each one of the drawings and make changes and then compare the changes and make sure that you didn't forget something and get embarrassed when all the stuff gets printed out. And so you're implying that once you make a change in one of these, you make them on all of them, aren't you?
Well, anything you do from the initial creation through the changes and reviews and all of those things, anywhere you enter the tool and make a change, that change is reflected in the database. So therefore, anytime you return to the database with another query, with another request for information, that change is going to be reflected in the answer.
Okay.
So therefore, it's reflected everywhere.
Yeah.
And all of this gives us it gives us a tool that's actually easier to use than the easy-to-use tools. We begin with...
What does this really mean from a business case standpoint?
Well,
what does this mean in time and effort and the engineer's time? I mean...
Well, it means that we're going to experience a savings because in both tools we have drag and drop capability. In the drawing tool, we can conveniently reuse the elements, but in Core, we don't need to reuse elements. So we don't need those elements to go be saved into a drawing pane so that we can drag them out. We're never going to drag them out again because they're in the database. And in the easy-to-use tool, even though it's relatively easy to redraw views, it's certainly not as easy as one-click views. So the bottom line on this to begin with is that it saves engineering time because the Core tool is easy and it's powerful. Now you ask about change population. If you were to add a function, and I did that actually in preparing the diagram here, I went into the EFFBD and I added that function up there, and incidentally that's just by the way another feature of Core. I wanted that function to be highlighted in all of these diagrams, so I turned it red and changed that formatting, which you can do in Core. But it added that function to every other diagram. That function now appears because I entered the database and made that change in the database. It's now changed every time the database answers a query that concerns that. So every time you ask it for a drawing that shows all of those functions, it's going to show your new one, no matter what form of drawing you're asking for.
Now, Zane, what happens if it's not unusual, there'll be 2 or 3 or 4 engineers working on a project at one time and they may be changing things. How quickly does this database get updated so the new changes appear on all of the drawings? I mean, does it happen instantaneously? Does it have to be uploaded? Or
no, it depends on which particular tool you're using. If you're using a server version, then of course it depends on how often you've communicated your work back to the server that you're connected to. So that can depend on setup. But if you're working in the same tool and you make a change in one diagram, then that change is reflected the next time somebody queries the database. So it's really a real-time change.
Before we get into the domains, I'd like you to describe that little story you told me a couple of weeks ago when you actually, the precursor to this is you actually ran a test with another engineer who you got him to create a diagram, and you created a diagram, and then what happened? Tell us about that.
What we did was he wanted to see core, and so I sort of made a deal on the sly. If he would show me the tool that he was working with, I would show him the new features in core. And so on the condition of anonymity of, you know, who he is and where he works, etc., he showed me the tool that they were working with. And it was one of the drawing tools, one of the very popular tools. And so what we did was we sat down and took a paper napkin in the restaurant, each of us with our laptops, and we sketched out a functional flow diagram. And he did it in his tool, and I did it in core. Took us about the same amount of time to do the initial diagram. We got them right. We looked at them. They looked substantially the same. Everything's all squared away. And so then I said, now let's do a little test here. Let's take this, and we did exactly what I did there. I said, let's produce an activity diagram from it. So he says, okay. So we said go, and he starts working in his tool, and he's constructing his activity diagram. And I, of course, just clicked the button in core and sat back. And he looked at me and he said, oh, did I jump the gun? Did I go too quick? And I said, no, you went too slow. I'm done. And he said, what do you mean? I turned my laptop around. He could see the activity diagram sitting there, and he was partially into his. So he said, that's amazing. And I said, well, let me show you something even more amazing. So I proceeded to click the buttons for sequence and n squared and idef 0. And he was just blown away by that. He said, you know, the tool that they had is really easy to use, and it is, but not as compared to one click. It really just doesn't get much easier than that.
So has he forgiven you for kind of taking him down that little garden path?
Well, no, it was all in good fun. So, and he was really actually wanting to see it. You know, he was wanting to see the capability. It just occurred to me that might be a good way to show it to him.
Okay, I just had to hear that again. I love it. What about domains here?
Well, you were talking about multiple engineers working on a system design, and of course, that's very, very true. The more complex the system, the more likely you are to have multiple engineers, and the more engineers you'll have. And these are the 4 classic systems engineering domains. This probably doesn't surprise anybody, any systems engineer who's watching this, that these are the domains. And what happens is these domains kind of become specialties, if you will. And so you have folks who really have lots of experience and expertise with working with requirements, or people who are system architects, and they have lots of experience working with the architecture. So the first thing that happens is that the domains kind of become stovepipes, and if you're old enough, you know that those are 4 stovepipes standing next to each other with the domain labels on them. So we get sequestered away from each other into stovepipe specialty areas, and it becomes the job of the systems engineer ultimately to feed all that back together and to make sure that it's coordinated and becomes a part of a coherent design. So the second thing that happens there is that each one of those domains develops or adopts a particular tool or a set of tools, or chooses from some tools pointed particularly at the domain. So you may well have a project going, and you got the requirements guys over here who are working with a requirements tool, and you have behavior people, hopefully. Often behavior gets forgotten or given kind of short shrift, but you've got a behavior tool of some type where the people are drawing up their behavior and keeping a record of what they're doing. You have an architecture tool where you're designing your architecture, and then test and evaluation, verification and validation. Lots of times you have different tools, and lots of times that's done in custom ways on particular products or projects or custom ways for particular companies. But what you find here is that now your sequestering of the domains is complicated by the fact that you're working in these tools and your information, your data about those domains is embedded in the tools, and you got to get data from one tool to the other. So you're now worrying about whether it will communicate. So will your requirements tool communicate with the architecture tool? Will your V&V tools touch both of those so that you can do bidirectional traceability? Can you integrate your behavior tool into that data flow? And you wind up with data exchanges. A metaphor that we like to use in looking at this is to talk about data exchanges are like a football team. It's football season again, and a risky play like a double reverse is risky because it involves exchanging the ball so many times. And every time you exchange the ball, hand it, lateral it, throw it, whatever you do to exchange possession of the ball brings on the risk that something's going to be lost in the exchange, like the football. So that risk makes plays with lots of exchanges riskier. And the data exchanges here from tool to tool make your project even riskier, because something's going to be dropped, something's going to be lost, something's going to be misinterpreted, something's going to be inconsistent. So first you have the problem of establishing bridges for the data to move on, and then you have the problem of making sure that the data has moved consistently. So the first thing that happens is your time involved starts to go up, because you got to take care of all that. You have to exchange, you have to build the bridge, you have to exchange the data, you have to check the data and make sure that it's all consistent, that you haven't missed anything. So all of that's an increase in your engineering time. And then every time you have to rework something because something was wrong, something was lost, something wasn't consistent, that's waste and risk. So you're increasing time and you're increasing waste. But of course there's a way to deal with that. Core deals with it by treating all four of your domains inside a single tool with a single repository.
But Zane, before we get too far into that, in the previous slide, when you've got all these different tools, there is that cost for buying the tool, the training cost. Everybody likes their own tools, but you've got all these tools running all over the place. I remember in COSI, one of the longtime consultants says, "Oh yeah, the U.S. Army, they manage, they believe in systems engineering by PowerPoint." And so everybody's got their tool, and there's not only the inconsistency of the data transfers and the difficulty. Of course, they all say that they can transfer information back and forth easily until you try it. But there's the cost of buying it, maintaining it, yearly maintenance costs, training new people, and the invariably the mistakes. This is part of that business case that you were talking about, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it sure is. You have the upfront costs of getting all those tools cobbled together, and then the upfront costs training people to use them and making sure that they use them well. And you still have the ongoing costs that we talked about when we talked about the increase of time and the increase in waste and risk. So you can't get rid of that anytime you're making the exchange. You know, you get a football coach on television and interview him and say, you know, you're running a wide open passing offense with all kinds of stunts and complex formations, etc. Isn't that risky? And he's going to start saying to you things like, well, my team, my plays are all designed to work together. My players practice together every day. We're all on the same team here. Right, we have the same system, and we don't make mistakes. Yeah, right. All you got to do is sit down on a Saturday afternoon while they're waiting to go from one game to another and see that funny highlights film of footballs going all kinds of unintended directions and into the hands of unintended people. So you run that risk, and you run it up front with the increase in cost for the tools and the training, et cetera, and then you run it all throughout your project.
So this is that whole single repository that helps you avoid all this.
Yeah, Core's
a lot of these risks.
Core's not going to let you, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the features that cause this, but Core's not going to let you be inconsistent within a single database. And you're not moving data around. You're simply querying it from different perspectives. So when you're working behavior, you're looking at the same database as when you're working architecture. You're just asking it questions framed up in different ways. Mm-hmm. But you're not looking at an architecture model and a behavior model and a requirements model and trying to justify them and make them all the same. You're looking truly at one model.
Well, that's sweet. That's really nice.
And that's the power. That's, you know, when you get down to the bottom line business case here, the bottom line business case comes from the fact that the translation that you make as your work progresses from one diagram to another, from one stage to another, is all being handled by the tool as opposed to a system where you're having to manage it by your own work. You're able to get that work, the rote work of having an engineer trying to do consistency checks and making sure that everything's lined up and risking an increased time, increased waste, increased budget. So you're increasing work, waste, and time and risking mistakes and burdening your engineers. Let the tool do it. Let the tool manage all that for you.
I remember when we were in COSI, there was somebody making a presentation, and they said, oh, we think the strength of our tool, and we only do part of the systems engineering, the whole process. The strength of our tool is that we can interface and connect to so many different people. And having a single repository is not the way to go. And I just looked at them and said, have they lost their minds? Do they really think that engineers can buy off on the fact that multiple tools and all of the inherent problems with those transfers back and forth is an advantage? Now, what about the whole documentation? Because when it all comes down to it, sooner or later, the engineer's got to push the button, and the documents have to come out. And how easy is it to do that with Core 9?
Well, that's exactly the issue. And you're coming up with the design in the first place only gets you part of the way home. Mm-hmm. You don't really have value for your customer until you're able to communicate that design. So you've got a design, and you need to tell your customer about it. Your customer's going to ask you, where are the risks in doing this, and how are they going to be managed? Or the customer's going to ask you, how far along are you? What do you see as the architectural configuration here? What are you doing? So we're all familiar with, especially these milestone conferences, where we got to get all the documentation together, and we need to make sure that everything is right and consistent. And so we announce a freeze to everybody, and we say, you know, you can't be in there changing things because I've got to put out all the documents, and we collate documents, and we produce them, and we get the data out of the different sources. And
we find mistakes, and
well, sure we do. And some fool over here thinks he's being paid to go on working. You know, he's got this illusion that his job is to work on the design, so he's in there making changes while we're trying to run out documents on a given freeze frame state. So documents are a lot of work. We hear people complain all the time. These milestone conferences turn us into document monkeys.
Yeah, that's somebody used that phrase. I was at a defense contractor with James Plimpton, our senior AE, and the woman stood up, the engineer stood up and said, "You mean we don't have this document monkey routine running for 24 hours before we've got to deliver the report, where everything freezes, everybody runs back and forth, and we're collating all these pages and we're replacing the pages?" And
the trick here for core is that core views a document that you produce as an answer to a query, just like a view. It's just a more complex view. You know, a diagram is a single sheet with a view on it. A document may be 50 pages with data from the database in it, but it's drawn on the database, so it's pulled out of the database and reported in whatever format you want to define. Now, lots of our reports are standard, so a triple S, an SDD, lots of standard reports that we all have to produce, and those have been scripted into core, and the standard scripts are there, and they have variables that you can modify. And of course, we teach you in training how to modify those variables so that you can put your own info into it. So if you look there at the Project X, has the Vitech logo on it. Obviously, you're not going to want to produce reports with the Vitech logo, so you simply tell it to get your logo, which you've put in a particular place. So the report contains a pointer to that. The report pulls up the project name. The report pulls up the report name. These scripts are set up to take advantage of the information you have there. But it's very important to note that these reports are simply, again, structured answers to queries of the database. The information's there in the database. So you don't have to run to 4 different sources or 5 different sources or 6 sources. And you don't have to say to everyone, stop so that I can run this report. Because
I see right up here on the front here, you got this risk rating matrix. Tell us about that. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you know how I get down these little...
Well, one of the things that core does, of course, is it allows you to track your risks. As you do your design, you start realizing, well, this represents a risk, and it needs to be mitigated with a mitigation plan. And core says we'll allow you to rate your risk, and we rate it on 2 different axes. So you can look at that rating matrix and say risk is rated, the vertical axis is how likely is it to occur, and the horizontal axis is, if it does occur, how dire are the consequences. And so you give that those ratings as attributes for a particular risk. So a risk has an ordered pair attribute. So it might be very likely to occur, but there's little or no consequence if it does. So that'd be a risk that's rated 5 and 1. And those boxes there, basically that matrix is divided off to point out to you that the risks you really need to work on are the ones that have heavy-duty consequences and are likely to occur, and those are the ones that fall in that red area. It's just a visual cue for you to use in making decisions.
Just a few things you've shown us so far is there's a lot of power. I know that one company that deals with a big airline manufacturer in France, but we won't name the company, they said that for the products they developed for that company, they said just the documentation, the ease of documentation paid for the software, the core software, in 3 months. Quite interesting. So this is a lot of power. What does it mean for your bottom line? Will you explain it a little bit more for us?
Ultimately, what it means is fairly straightforward. Because you're able to produce these structured answers to your queries, whether that's a diagram or a report whatever it is, because you're able to produce those quickly and consistently, and because you're able to monitor in real time all of the changes to the design, you reduce your waste because you're reducing risk, you're reducing rework, you're reducing all kinds of mistakes because you're not moving from one engineer to another, one repository to another. So you drive down your waste, you reduce the amount of sheer engineering work that you have to do. And what companies talk about, you're right, companies consistently come back and tell us there's a huge savings here in terms of time to produce documentation. You know, they have to, lots of engineering teams are like a sailing ship turning into a big storm. You know, they got all hands on deck and everybody's cranking and raising and climbing and pulling and tugging to get the documentation out. With Core, all you're doing is selecting the scripts and filling in the variables. So you reduce your engineering time and work, and you reduce the time that it takes to do it. So to produce 4 drawings is a significant savings in time. And what you find there is that means money. All of those things mean money, and they mean money to your bottom line because you're doing the same work with less waste, less time, and less engineering work. So that impacts your bottom line. But there really is more. There's more to the picture than that, because Core has a number of very, very powerful features which can be brought into play. We're now able to reuse pieces of models, to reuse flows, to reuse elements, not just within the same model, but across projects.
Well, so, if we were to take a look at, let's say, an auto manufacturer, they're going to use an engine in one vehicle, and they had everything all set up and all the documentation and the drawings, and they wanted to use it in another vehicle. It's similar to what Warren Smith did when he demonstrated Core 9 a couple of months ago when we introduced it. He just moved it from one repository to another, and the new car was being populated before our eyes. Between the engine and the steering and the security system and some of the electronics, he had half the automobile built. And all the documentation, everything was there. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Sure, and it's done without having to redo the engineering work, and it's done without unintentionally introducing inconsistencies into the work. It's all there simply to be reused. We've got the capability to simulate, so if you want to know, if you want to sit down and say, okay, how would this work if I allocated my functions to components in this way versus allocating them in that way? Well, you can frame it up and simulate and look at it, what we call virtual prototyping or trades.
And that's along the lines of fail early and often and figure out what's going on before you get too deep into the V&B.
Right, and fail in virtual models rather than failing in bent metal and glass.
Yeah, that's the expensive part, isn't it?
Exactly. And then we have bridges. You know, other products talk about, well, we can communicate with this, we can communicate with that. We have bridges to other tools because you're going to encounter work that's been done by your customer, work that's been done by other engineers, etc. You'll have a need to communicate with another tool. So we have a doors bridge that makes it easy to move data from doors to Core and makes it easy to move data from Core back to doors.
Now this doors thing, I mean, we could always transfer information back and forth in the last few versions, but in 9, the doors, well, let's face it, we've got a good relationship with doors, the IBM doors. Nice people, a good product for what it does. But now the be able to transfer information back and forth is really, really easy. With Core 9, it was made very simplistic. A few clicks and it's done.
Yeah, it's
right?
It's very easy. And we talk with a number of tools using our comma separated variables. Our CSV capability will allow us, any tool that can produce CSV information, we can figure out how to talk with them through our CSV parsers. We have consistency checkers. Core will actually go through and look at your data, and you can go to an element and run a consistency checker, or go to a project and run a consistency checker. And Core will show you right on the screen, you're missing this attribute, or you haven't defined this. It has active consistency checkers. If you try to introduce a recursive relationship that doesn't make any sense, Core's gonna ring a bell and ask you if you really intend to do that. So that's pretty powerful and work saving in and of itself. And all of that adds up to money.
So how do we harness all that power for this project success that you're talking about? How do we, I mean, Core 9 does these things, and it does a lot more than what we're covering today. We're just covering some of the high points, but let's get in just a little bit more depth in the next 5 or 10 minutes.
Well, of course, ultimately what you want to do is you want to take, and what we've been talking about are the mechanics. You want to take the mechanics and translate the power of the mechanics into the substantive work. We did a webinar several weeks ago about the SEI study. Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute did a study, which the bottom line on that study is that if you use mature systems engineering practices in your project, they demonstrated that will lead you to a greater probability of project success in a well-researched and well-written paper that's worth your while. You can find it on the SEI website.
And the more complex the product, the more success you would have if you had mature processes versus immature processes.
Exactly. So dealing with complexity, and you know, who among us is not dealing with complexity these days? That makes having mature processes even more important. Where Core comes into the picture on this is that when you drill into the mature practices, and this is a segment of the research instrument that SEI used. If you look down there at question number 3, they're testing requirements development and management processes. So they're asking you basically here if you have a way to document and reflect allocation from requirements through to the system configuration. Down into the components. So can you basically establish, do you have a way of establishing that you have bidirectional traceability from your requirements through your behavior into your components and back again? And if you're using Core 9, you certainly can. You can do it in a number of ways. Now, I happen to pull this way because it's the most graphical way, the most visual way of looking at it. You could have a traceability matrix, and you could go down through the traceability matrix, one of the outputs from Core. But you can look at this traceability hierarchy diagram, and you can see that if you begin with the high-level requirements, and this is from a demonstration project that I did where I mapped out the process of checking customers out at a convenience store. So the highest level requirement was to check out the customers. And that's refined down into requirements to ascertain what the prices of the goods they want to buy are, determine the totals, and accept the payments. So you can take it all the way through the refined requirements down into the behaviors. If you look down there, you find that it becomes the basis of behaviors like verify a credit card, verify a check. And then you find that that's allocated into the components. So you can see that all of the requirements here are allocated down into components. And you can trace that back to the ultimate requirements, all the way back out to the top level requirement. So you would answer that question, strongly agree. Yes, we do. We have that capability. In other words, we have a mature requirements development management set of processes that we're using, and here's the evidence of it, because CORE is making that possible.
Now, as I read that study, I saw that there were about 120 questions that went out as part of their survey, and about 25 of those questions had to do with, you know, who are you, what do you do, how many employees do you have, you know, things not having to do with the projects. So about 95 of them had to do with the actual processing, the engineering. And when I went through and looked at all those questions and just checked them off, and I said, it's one thing to have the systems engineering maturity. It's another thing to have the tools that allow you to be mature in your processes so you can do it more easily. And I saw that CORE, just on the surface, just going through checking the boxes off, if you use CORE, you would check 76 of those boxes out of 95 on the high end. So this really, what your slide here says, core capabilities and the SE practices really gives you this mature project success. It's very interesting. I wish they would have also asked some questions about tools, but they didn't, so maybe we can talk them into it next time. So CORE saves time and waste and work and helps to improve the quality of our solutions and almost anybody's solution, right?
Yeah, it sure does. And you know, just to cruise back across what we've done, it begins with ease of use. You've got the drag and drop ease of use. When somebody says, well, I want to use this tool because it's easy to use, I would argue that CORE is no harder to use than any other tool, even at the level of drawing your diagrams. And then CORE adds to that right away by giving you the power of diagrams on demand. Your diagrams are simply one click away. So there's no redrawing involved, none of that effort. And then we have real-time updating because we're dealing with that database on the back end rather than making alterations and drawings ourselves. So that means fewer mistakes, the project's up to date, everything is consistent, the tools do that. Combine that with the really powerful functionality of cross-project reuse, simulation, the bridges to other tools and data, the consistency checkers, and more. And that's even more savings because checking your consistency by hand means more time, more work out of your engineers. And you save that when the tool does that for you. So what we have is an easy-to-use interface on the front end coupled to the single repository, the powerful database on the back end. And that saves work, it saves waste, and it saves time. And the bottom line here is that CORE both raises the quality of your final product and it enhances your bottom line while it does it.
And some of the things we've talked about today in this business case summary, there are only 3 or 4 of 5 of the attributes in the new Core 9 that really contributes to this business case, saving time, effort, and money. This has been really good today. I hope everyone got a lot out of it. Now, if someone would like a deeper demonstration of CORE, it's fairly easy. You just put it into type your message in and say, have somebody give me a call, and one of our AEs will take you through CORE and show you the ease of use, and they'll show you the business case. And so we can get that, we can do that pretty easy. Let's see if we've got any questions. Emma, do we have any questions lined up and for Zane?
Yes, Jim, we do. We've already received some really great questions, so thanks to all the participants. I encourage everyone else to join the discussion right now and submit your questions using the question and chat features in your GoToWebinar window. So our first question is from Russell. He asks, does Core 9 always start from the creation of diagrams?
No, it doesn't have to. you could begin working with your requirements. You know, the classic view of top-down design is that you would work in requirements and then translate those requirements. We advocate a layered approach where you work at a very, very high level in your systems design first, and you work in all 4 domains, so you move back and forth. It hinges entirely on what you're comfortable with. The point is that if you're most comfortable in the visual way, you can do that in core now, and you don't have to go seek another tool to give you the power of that visual interface. But no, you don't have to begin there. You get to begin where you want to begin.
All right, thank you, Zane. Our next question is from Ajit. He wants to know, how long does it take to become proficient in core?
Core's like any other tool. You can become proficient. Our course is 4 days long. The basic course that covers most of the functionality of core and goes through a detailed buttonology on how to accomplish particular tasks. The most important thing that I would say to anybody is what anyone who talks about software would say, and that is you need to get in there and try it. And the more you use it, the more proficient you'll become.
All right. Our next question comes from Jenna. She is asking, is there a training class for new users of core?
There certainly is. We have our standard class, as I said. The introductory class is 4 days long, and we will offer that on site for your team. So we'd be more than happy to provide that.
Okay. Dan wants to know, he says, you mentioned you have a core doors connector. How easy is it to import requirements into core?
It's simply, really literally a matter of a few clicks. Basically, you probably spend longer determining what data you want to bring across than you do actually doing it at a tool.
All right. Our next question is from Bob. He says, some changes are not desired to be incorporated into work already begun at a previous point in time. Are there methods in core to accommodate this?
I understand the question. You were breaking up there.
I'm sorry, Zane. I think we have a little bit of a slow internet connection. Can you hear me better now?
A little bit.
Okay, I'll try again. Bob wants to know, some changes are not desired to be incorporated into work already begun at a previous point in time. Are there methods in core to accommodate this?
I still am not getting that.
Let me try one more time here. Some changes are...
Coming through clear. Go ahead.
It's okay. Some changes are not desired to be incorporated into work already begun at a previous point in time. Are there methods in core to accommodate this?
Some changes are not desired to be incorporated to work begun at a previous time. That's the piece I'm not really understanding.
Okay.
If you don't want to make those changes, you certainly don't have to.
Well, Bob, if you want to ping us and go ahead and clarify that, we'll get back to you at a later point. Sounds good?
We'll have somebody call Bob and go through it in a little more depth in the questions. It's hard to ask some of these questions just in that little box. Go ahead, Eva.
All right. Moving right along, we have a question from Francois. He says, how can one develop bridges with other tools?
Basically, the bridge is in the CSV, comma-separated variables capability, and you set it up through that, output in that format from the other tool and input into core through that. So that's the basis of developing those bridges.
Okay, thank you, Zane. We have just a couple more. John wants to know, can we get a free trial version of Core 9?
We have an evaluation program, and if you're interested in that, our sales folks can talk to you about what's entailed there.
Just send us a note and just ask for an eval, and we'll get in touch with you and figure out how long you like to take a look at it, and who in your team, and we really want to understand what are you trying to accomplish, so we can attend to your needs. So just give us a little note, and we'll be happy to give you a buzz in a couple of days.
And lots of times it's more helpful to have us demonstrate the tool to you and then let you ask questions and ask us to show you specific things that you're interested in, because we can get to that much quicker many times than you can even in an evaluation setting.
All right. We have one last question here from Jason. He asks, can Core 9 serve as an enterprise architecture tool competing with something like System Architect?
The one-word answer to that is certainly.
Yes.
You can do that without question, and even go beyond that, because you can connect your enterprise architecture internally in the database with your behavior and your verification and testing and your requirements capabilities.
Now, Zane, if somebody wanted to reach you personally to ask any questions, your email address is?
zscott@vitechcorp.com.
And mine is J. Obermayer, that's a J, initial J, Obermayer at vitechcorp.com. If anyone would like, if you'd like an evaluation, let us know. If you'd like to see a demonstration of Core, we'll be happy to have a systems engineer take you up and answer all your questions. I guess that's it. It's been a nice, we ran just a little bit late, but we had a lot of questions. Thank you very much, Zane. You've done a great job today in our second of our series of how to provide a business case for systems engineering, model-based systems engineering, and specifically Core 9. Thank you very much, Zane. It's always informative and lively. Eva?
All right. Well, thank you both very much. That wraps up the Q&A and the presentation for today. If we didn't get to your question, we will contact you directly to ensure your question is answered. And as always, if you have any other questions or comments that you didn't send in, we invite you to post them on the forum of our community site at community.vitechcorp.com. And as I mentioned before, a recording of today's webinar will be posted in the resources section of our website within 24 hours. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen in either a new browser tab or a new window. Please take a moment to provide us with feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in the future. Once again, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.